Evidence and conclusions reached by human rights and medical experts point to an ongoing large-scale crime against humanity in China, and that is forced organ harvesting. Reports say that the persecuted adherents of the spiritual practice Falun Dafa are likely the primary targets. To discuss developments this past year on combating the forced organ harvesting phenomenon in China under the CCP, joining us is Jan Jekielek, senior editor at the Epoch Times, host of American Thought Leaders on Epoch TV, and author of the new upcoming book on this very topic, Killed to Order: China's Organ Harvesting Industry and the True Nature of America's Biggest Adversary, out on March 10th. So Jan, so good to have you here. Good afternoon. Can you just speak to us to start off? What would you say is the biggest step forward so far in stopping forced organ harvesting under the Chinese Communist Party?
Well, really, it's been the accumulation of almost 20 years of work. And I would say the single event that I think precipitated the biggest knowledge or the awareness of this was the survivor emerging. There's actually a survivor, Cheng Pei-ming, a man who is missing part of his lung and part of his liver and lived to tell the tale. Just to let people know, this concept of forced organ harvesting, this is something that can only happen with a state actor. Okay, this is something where you need to have a large population of people that you've dehumanized through propaganda, and you need to incarcerate a whole lot of them, perhaps 1 million, it's unclear. And then you need to DNA type them or blood type them and tissue type them at the very least. And then you actually have a database. So that's when someone can look up an ad, and this has happened many times over the last 20 years, look up an ad, and the ad says, I can get you a new heart in 2 weeks for a hefty sum. And that you can actually go to China and get a predetermined, a pre-timed transplant, scheduled transplant, which is something that's impossible in any ethical system. So this is something very different than the typical black market organ trade that we hear about. But the biggest development, as I said, would be that there's actually someone who lived the tale. And as a result, there's been a whole flurry of activity this last year, especially on the legislative side around this.
And Jan, I'll just add to that. His name is Cheng Pei-ming, and what's crazy to me about this is that I was doing research, right? He didn't even know he had a part of his lung and liver removed, not until he came to the United States and had a medical exam. That is just mind-boggling to me. And he continued to speak out in 2025. So based on that, maybe you can talk to us about what more have we learned about China's forced organ harvesting machine?
Well, there was a big moment that happened, actually, and that was, it's been dubbed the hot mic moment of Xi Jinping. You know, it almost sounds like a joke. Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin, and Kim Jong-un walk into a bar. They didn't walk into a bar. It was in Tiananmen Square. They were walking, and on a hot mic was caught elements of a conversation. Basically, Xi says to Putin, I'm going to paraphrase here, you know, at 70, we're just a baby at this point. And Putin says back, through continual organ transplantation, we can perhaps achieve immortality. And then Xi returns with the idea that 150 years is the target. And this 150 years is kind of a code word for China's, you could call it like an elite longevity project, Project 981. They always have these kind of numerical names for things. And what I realized the moment I heard this, right, and this is the thing, I've been in this space 20 years, reporting on it for 20 odd years on and off, but it just hadn't occurred to me how central the organ industry itself is to that longevity project, right? Imagine we're talking about, you know, an estimated $9 billion a year industry, say, you know, 60 to 90,000 transplants a year from likely prisoners of conscience. I mean, this is a massive scale thing we're talking about, right? Well, here's what I realized at this moment. Imagine what it would be worth if you're one of these super elite in communist China and you have unlimited on-demand organs available to you forever. And that strikes me as something that's worth more than even $9 billion. So that is a huge revelation this year.
Jan, do we know at all if forced organ harvesting in China has increased over the years or decreased?
So there's a bit of debate around this, around the experts. So basically it happened at a low level until about the year 2000. Then they incarcerate, you know, 1 million plus Falun Gong practitioners, okay, into the entire system. And then basically the hospitals start growing, the number of transplants starts growing, it peaks up to the year about 2005, near exponential growth during that time period. And as far as we can tell, there's been huge amounts of transplants since that time to present. But because the international community didn't really respond meaningfully, there were even organizations that I would argue were basically running cover for the whole system. In 2014, the CCP turned to another victim group, we believe, the Uyghurs. And this is actually, Ethan Gutman is writing a book right now, The Xinjiang Procedure. It's going to be published around the same time as Kill to Order, where he looks deeply into this question on how much has this, how many Uyghurs have been added to the system. So at this point, we're unclear. We know that there's millions of Uyghurs in the forced labor camp systems, we could call them concentration camps. And Ethan has, I think, shown quite definitively that some of them are victims of forced organ harvesting. It's unclear if this is in addition to the Falun Gong practitioners that are currently being used that way. It's unclear whether it's gone down. It's very hard to get these numbers right because they're all a state secret. People can be executed for revealing some of them. But I think the biggest take-home message is that if you don't actually deal with these types of extreme crimes against humanity, they shift, and in this cases, or add another victim group, because why not? The opportunity is there, the business opportunity is there. And the other piece that is also actually incredibly important is because of America's and other Western countries' deep engagement with Communist China along a whole lot of different vectors, including, for example, training the surgeons or providing materials for transplantation. There's many research grants, collaborations, and so forth. America's system itself has actually become, there are dead donor rule violations in the American system, and 2 transplant systems have actually been decertified by HHS for these reasons. And I would argue it's when you work with a system where, as far as we can tell, essentially most of the transplants, or probably all of the, if not all of the transplants, are dead donor rule violations, that actually rubs off. So it's a huge, huge issue.
Okay, Jan, I want to try to fit in a few more angles here. I want to talk to you about the U.S.'s efforts to combat forced organ harvesting. So some positive developments, both the Stop Forced Organ Harvesting Act of 2025 and the Falun Gong Protection Act passed in the House, but it's currently stalled in the Senate. But the good news is Secretary of State Marco Rubio has promised to be helpful in any way possible to facilitate the passage of the bills that aim to counter this atrocity. So maybe you can speak to us about the U.S.'s efforts here. Do you expect more movement on those bills in 2026?
Well, Secretary Rubio, as senator, he actually originated the Falun Gong Protection Act in the Senate in the previous Congress. So you can see his kind of commitment to this issue. I think the opportunity is huge. I mean, it's really only very recent that we've had any federal legislation related to forced organ harvesting. There have been a few resolutions that passed by acclamations, but these 2 pieces of legislation that you mentioned, they actually passed the House near unanimously. I think there was 1 dissent across both of these bills. So this is kind of a no-brainer in the Senate. I think that the issue is they just have to be brought out of committee, and it'll take a few senators that are, deeply committed to making that happen. There's a number of them that are already working on it. I think the other part is, there's obviously people watching out there. If this legislation is important to you, and I think it should be important to anyone, because this is, again, I always argue that these very extreme crimes against humanity, as we talked about earlier, they spread if they're not kind of held in check, right? It's not about interfering in the affairs of another country or something. It's basically like, protecting ourselves from some very, very extreme things. So what I would hope is that this year we see a groundswell of people basically reaching out to their elected representatives and asking them for support. The other part I should mention, there's actually 7 states now that have actually passed legislation into law that makes it illegal for Medicare and insurance to actually fund transplants in China. So that's also, and so, 43 states to go, and a number of them are considering it. It's a big shift, and I think it can really transform federally as well.
For sure, we'll keep an eye on those developments throughout 2026. And Jan, just one last thing here. The documentary film, State Organs Unmasking Transplant Abuse in China, it was an official contender for Best Documentary Feature at the Oscars in 2025. Can I just ask you, how much more aware do you think the public is or has become in the past year on this issue?
I would say massively. And the reason I say this, again, I've been following this issue for the better part of 20 years. And when we started, the hardest thing to do was actually to get people to accept that this could possibly be happening. Because as human beings, we just have this revulsion when we hear such extreme things. It's like some of us just shut down. I mean, I was even doing this at the beginning. So I think at the moment when I talk to people about it, when I give talks, I've given briefings, I've talked about it in state houses and so forth. Basically, people are ready to accept that this is something that's really happening. And I think that moment is really transformational because basically that kind of spreads the moment it becomes collectively something that's understood in society. I actually think we can make an impact. And these pieces of legislation, by the way, they're not just performative, right? They will, for example, sanction some of the people involved. And those people, maybe they have exit strategies to America with, all of China's difficulties today. Most of them actually do. If they do, then they'll think maybe twice about being involved in this industry if they want to keep that exit strategy. And that'll save a few lives, right? So basically, I think we're in a unique situation, at least in the past 20 years, that we've actually known as a fact that this thing is happening.
Well, all right, Jan, it's really great to speak with you. And I just want to encourage all of our viewers watching right now to take a look at your book that is coming out next year. It will have really insightful information. Thank you for speaking with us today, Jan.
Such a pleasure.
Taiwan remained on high alert today after China conducted massive military drills around the island. Taiwan's Coast Guard said the situation is now calming, with Chinese ships gradually departing, but emergency response centers remain active. The communist regime called the drills a warning against forces seeking Taiwan independence. They follow